Welcome to Feminism Today, everyone. I'm Sophia Johnson in New York. Pakistan plunged into a political crisis after the Prime Minister Imran Khan dissolved parliament ahead of a vote on a no-confidence motion in which he was widely expected to lose. The standoff has thrown the country of 220 million people, which the military has ruled for almost half its history since independence in 1947, into a full-blown constitutional crisis, both fueling anger among opposition and deepening concerns about economic and political stability in Islamabad. Constitutional experts are now debating their legality and pondering whether Khan and his rivals can find a way forward. Here to help us understand what political upheaval in Pakistan means for the US and the rest of the world is Amber Rahim Shamsi, a former broadcaster who is now the director of the Center of Excellence in Journalism at the Institute of Business Administration in Karachi. Amber Rahim Shamsi, welcome to Feminism Today.
Thank you so much, Sophia. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, before we get into why this is important, we talk a bit about the background of this vote. Pakistan's president dissolved the National Assembly on the advice of Prime Minister Imran Khan. The deputy speaker declared the motion for a no-confidence vote against Khan unconstitutional and part of a larger plot by foreign powers to interfere in Pakistan's democracy. How do no-confidence motions work?
All right, there's a lot to unpack here just in that one question, but let's begin with a no-confidence motion. So Pakistan has a parliamentary system of democracy. The leader of the House becomes the Prime Minister, and the leader of the House is elected by all the members of Parliament, and a majority vote, in this case 172 or more, are needed to elect the Prime Minister. At any time within any parliamentary democracy, if the members of the House feel that the Prime Minister is not doing his job properly, they can actually vote against him. And this is called a vote of no confidence, which means that the House or a majority of the House have lost confidence in the Prime Minister to be the Prime Minister or the leader of the House or lead the country. Mm-hmm. In this case, the opposition parties, and there are several involved in this, had tabled a vote of no confidence on the 8th of March. And constitutionally, according to the Constitution of Pakistan, the vote is meant to happen within 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. But the Prime Minister and the ruling party, the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, or the PTI, mm-hmm. kept delaying the vote. First, they said that there is the National Assembly, or the lower house of Parliament, where the vote was due to take place. There was some routine refurbishment that was supposed to take place. Mm-hmm. And then they said that there was a very important international conference, the Organization of Islamic Countries, and their foreign ministers were due to meet on the 23rd of March. So, we can't have the vote of no confidence. Mm-hmm. And that's against the Constitution, as I said, and the rules of procedure. Eventually, what you saw was throughout this period, when the vote actually happened just this Sunday, is that Prime Minister Imran Khan revealed during a political rally that he had received what he had waved about a letter. And he said, well, there's a foreign conspiracy. There have been threats to me and my person and my life. And I know that these opposition parties are actually colluding with the Western power, mm-hmm. although he didn't name the power at the time, to de-seat me. And that's why that's why they filed this vote of no confidence. Now, mm-hmm. again, according to the law and constitution, if a vote of no confidence has been filed against a prime minister, has been tabled in the assembly, he can't dismiss the assembly. That power is taken away from him, because that is the fear that he's going to sort of, what you could say, is run away from the vote, as it were. Mm-hmm. And that was the end of that. So at the moment, just if you're going to ask me where we are right now, it's been 4 days. We don't have a functioning federal government. Mm-hmm. There's also a power tussle in the largest state, or we call it province, where Khan had his party was also ruling over there. So his chief minister resigned. We don't have a functioning government in the largest province, which is Punjab. And there is a legal battle going on in the Supreme Court, whether this was constitutional or not. The opposition has said that this is a constitutional coup, that Khan is a civilian dictator. Indeed, several an International Human Rights Watch group. Human Rights Watch has also described it as a constitutional coup. And the economy is in a free fall.
Let's unpack some of this a little bit, just so our viewers can better understand the context. I have read no prime minister in Pakistan's history has ever completed a full 5-year term. Why specifically is Pakistan's opposition seeking PM Khan's removal?
Okay, and this is a very valid question, because why now is a question that many people are asking. Why now? Because the economy has been in trouble for the last 3.5 to 4 years that Khan has been ruling. We've lost a third of the value of our GDP. Inflation is in double digits and has been before the pandemic and after the pandemic, when we were showing a little bit of growth. We have about 2 months worth of foreign exchange left. We're a very import dependent country as well. Khan has changed the finance minister and finance team multiple times. So there is a lot of dissatisfaction in how he's handled the government. He came in on the populist slogans of ending corruption, which he could not. Most cases were filed against the opposition leaders. He came on the slogan of establishing what he called the state of Medina, or the Riyasat-e-Medina, which is a sort of throwback to the time when the Prophet Muhammad, had established the state of Medina, which is where the poor are looked after. In fact, what we've seen is unemployment and poverty. It certainly did rise, even if there was a little bit of stability last year. But we've seen people's purchasing power reduced. The other very important factor here to remember is that Khan came to power on the back with the support of the powerful military establishment. Okay. And that's where you sort of, the question of why doesn't any prime minister in Pakistan complete his or her tenure, that's actually sort of where the trouble is. The military has had an outsized role in Pakistan's political life. We've had at least 4 dictatorships that I can think of immediately off the top of my head. And even when we had democratic governments, they were fragile and dominated by the military. Khan's government has been called a hybrid regime, which essentially means the military helped him come into power through a very controversial election, has provided political support, has helped with the economy, and all of these remains obviously outside of its constitutional role, as well as foreign policy, which is traditionally where the military did have more of a say anyway, has really helped him along. So what happened last October was that Khan, as any civilian prime minister tends to do, started to assert himself a little. And this was over the appointment of the spy chief. He disagreed with the army chief, or the chief of our forces, on who the spy chief ought to be. And you saw that the support, or there was a distrust sort of grew after that. The army chief is due to be, his appointment is due this November. The budget is due in June and July. So the opposition figured this is when Khan is at his weakest, because he doesn't have as much support of the military as he did.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the growing concerns and frustrations over economic mismanagement, rising prices, and really concerns over the direction of Pakistan's foreign policy under Khan's leadership. You touched on a little bit earlier, the Khan administration is crying that this is Washington's interference and that his political opponents are doing Washington's bidding by trying to oust him. Are these rumors, facts, or something in between?
Okay, yeah. It's funny. I was I take one of those Uber type services around in Karachi these days, because I just moved here, and I was talking to the taxi driver. And I know this is a bit of cliche, talking to the taxi driver to find out the pulse of the country, but it's reflected in a Gallup poll, incidentally, that just came out yesterday. So I thought, well, maybe the taxi driver wasn't so wrong. And I was asking him what he thought about all of this situation. He said, well, I like how Khan presents Pakistan internationally, but I don't want him back because inflation is been really tough for us. So there is that dilemma, and this is reflected in the Gallup poll. About 36% of Pakistanis believe that there is a foreign conspiracy against Khan. The majority don't, which I thought was interesting. But here's the thing, and here's how the story goes. In a sort of big, huge political rally, Imran Khan lays the case for how his performance of government, what he's done, emphasizing in particular how he has shown the West their true colors. He's talked about Islamophobia. He's talked about he went to Russia just the day that Russia invaded Ukraine or attacked Ukraine.
Right.
And he cites these reasons as why the West is out to get him. He waved a letter, what he called a letter, described as a letter at that time. He said, well, I have proof of this, and I have received a written threat. Reporting later in several newspapers showed that this was based on a cable that the Pakistani ambassador to the US had written, obviously as they do, ambassadors do, back home to the Foreign Office. And it was based on a conversation between a US Foreign Office, a State Department official, who, we haven't seen the contents of that cable, but I'm just describing what happened, what has been reported on, which described essentially the fact that the US is uncomfortable with Khan around.
Right.
As that's as far as we know, because it is obviously under there was a case filed in a lower court, a high court, so that the contents of that letter or cable cannot be disclosed under the Official Secrets Act. So we don't know the exact not that content, the content of that cable. He's been using that consistently. His ministers, ex-ministers now, I would say, has been using that. Eventually, just before the vote was due to happen, when it was actually very clear that Khan would lose it, when the allies had decided or announced that they would actually vote against Khan, thus he had lost his majority, the numbers game was up. There was a National Security Committee meeting, which essentially sort of condemned the interference of blatant, I'm using words that the readout said, which was blatant interference in Pakistan's internal affairs, and a strong démarche would be sent. That was the end of that. So there's also an interesting process at play here. This very important cable, or this so-called threat or foreign conspiracy, was unveiled in a political rally rather than going through proper channels, which is through your intelligence, through an investigation. Khan made the accusation and then, sort of quickly had it half ratified by the National Security Committee, where all the services chiefs incidentally also sit, and important ministers. And he through various broadcasts and through various rallies, he's let slip that this is the US. And I believe there was a strongly worded démarche sent from Pakistan to the US, but that's about it. Sources within the military have been keen to distance themselves. They said that we actually have not signed off on this letter, and we should. They're very cleverly using sources or leaks through the media rather than coming out directly to clear the air or clear the situation.
Now, reports from the global media watchdog suggest it is true press freedoms in Pakistan are deteriorating. Why is Pakistan's media under pressure, and where is that pressure coming from?
Okay, well, the pressure is coming from two sources, both the ex-ruling party, or Khan's party, the PTI, as well as the military establishment that was supportive of Khan. And I think it's interesting where it is during this particular government where we saw many journalists attacked in their homes, attacked on the streets in the capital city, even with CCTV footage, no investigation. The investigations never were concluded. Nobody was tried. These were clear-cut cases. We've also seen how interviews of opposition leaders were suddenly pulled off the air as soon as they'd started. We've seen how journalists have been harassed on social media through massive trolling campaigns. The Cybercrime Act has been weaponized against journalists who have been critical of the military establishment or Khan's government as well. So journalists who are critical of Khan or the establishment, their credibility has been damaged, or in many cases have been asked quietly behind the scenes through influence and pressure on media owners to pull critical journalists off screen. We have one very prominent, very famous news anchor. His name is Hamid Mir. He was off air for about 9 months. That's just one example. There are many, many other examples. I mean, I was an example of how social media was weaponized against me. I was very critical. I used to host a show, a current affairs show on a mainstream news channel. And there were massive trolling attempts against me. My Twitter account was hacked. My producer had cases filed against him. And then we were asked to eventually leave by the channel. So it's been a difficult year a few years in which Reporters Without Borders have described Khan as a predator of press freedom. We've fallen several places behind. Many stories and reports never made it on air or went to press because they were pulled or there was pressure to pull them off. So it's been a difficult 3.5 years. And I would say that it really goes back to the whole concept of a hybrid regime where Khan and the military establishment sort of helped each other out in order to create a particular narrative on mainstream media.
There are a reported 2.8 million Afghan refugees in 2020, half of whom are said to be living in Pakistan. Can we talk a little bit about the domestic pressure after the Taliban takeover?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a very excellent question, and I'm afraid that it's been forgotten in all this political turmoil and mess. The fall of Kabul and the takeover of the Taliban in Afghanistan was obviously an outcome that partly supported by Pakistan. That has been Pakistan's position, that the US needs to leave and there needs to be an Afghan negotiated settlement. In fact, I remember in a speech, Imran Khan said that now that the US is gone, that Pakistan has sort of shed the shackles of slavery as well. The only complication here is that increasingly we've seen that because many militants that had been routed during our war on terror, post 2007 in particular, fled to Afghanistan, and they are still there. Pakistan had been trying to negotiate with the Taliban, and in fact had asked the Taliban to be interlocutors, so that these they're called the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, or the TTP, so that they would be returned here, or they could be rehabilitated. Except what we've seen is a rise in, especially along the border areas, a rise in terrorist activities and clashes between the Afghan Taliban and Pakistani officials. So while it felt like there would be a more cordial relationship, rather than the relationship that Pakistan had with the Ghani administration, the relationship has strained. The other sort of, Pakistan has also maintained that it would not take any more Afghan refugees. We don't have the capacity.
Sure.
We don't have a refugee policy. The Afghan refugees that we took in the 80s, many of them remained. We've been trying to repatriate them back to Afghanistan. That process slowed down in the last 3 years with the rise of the war in Afghanistan, or the clashes and with the TTP and Daesh as well. So Pakistan has really tried to sort of control the flow of refugees back as well. So we don't have additional refugees as a result of the Taliban takeover, and that's a deliberate policy because we felt that we could not afford it anymore.
Right.
But what has happened is that our relationship with the Afghan Taliban, or our hopes that our eastern neighbor would be friendlier, have taken a bit of a beating. And we've seen multiple attacks across the border. And we had a huge attack on a Shia mosque, actually, just I think in this year, in which over 60 to 70 people lost their lives. So the fear is that the economy is not doing great. There's political turmoil. There's also that fear of not being able, the leadership, as it were, not being able to manage the borders. Well, I wouldn't say manage the borders, but at least that there will be a resurgence of terrorist incidents. It hasn't so far, but the fear remains.
Right. There are those who say that the Taliban could not have won a military victory over the years without a physical sanctuary in Pakistan. What is your reaction to this assessment?
Well, I mean, there's no secret that the Haqqani network were based in Pakistan. And in fact, just recently, our former interior minister also admitted it. And in fact, I remember an interview with another foreign minister while he was advisor. And he said, there are good Taliban and bad Taliban, and we need them because we need leverage. Pakistan has obviously maintained that we don't have as much leverage as we were meant to, as we could have. But the idea behind many of the Afghan Taliban branches of the Afghan Taliban and their families remaining here is that, we would be able to have a sort of, as I said, a more cordial neighbor in the east, in Afghanistan, eventually, when the US would pull out. But that, as I said, hasn't quite worked out to plan.
Can we talk a little bit about human rights, on education, on women? How is the world supposed to deal with the humanitarian needs of women in the region in Pakistan, but at the same time place conditions or strings, to put it bluntly, to encourage better behavior in this space?
That's a very difficult question because as we've seen that the Afghan Taliban, if you're talking about the Afghan Taliban, they're promised the girls that girls and will be able to go back to school and college and resume normal education by March, and we're in April, and we've seen the opposite happen, where they've shut down schools and really sort of dug down on the fact that they need their money. I think the mistake here is also, for instance, the frozen accounts. I think the U.S. I think that the U.S. by keeping the money in those frozen accounts, by talking about distributing that money partly to 9/11 victims, is actually taking that money away from Afghan people. I'll be honest. I think that's a travesty. This is not the US's money to give away. This is the Afghan people's money. And as I understand that there's distrust of the Afghan Taliban, and perhaps because of the way the US pulled out, the way that the fall of Kabul happened, and those scenes of desperate Afghan people clinging to US planes, I can see how there's been a degree of reputational damage of Vietnam too, and all of those things. I mean, I understand that, but the problem here is that that malnutrition is on the rise in Afghanistan, and it's a desperate, tragic situation. What do you do? What is the solution here? I think the idea behind having Pakistan as an interlocutor was to keep the Afghan Taliban engaged, because that is the only way you can at least help the Afghan people. You speak of women and girls in Pakistan as well. I want to point out that we're not in the situation that Afghanistan is in, where education is bad. But I would say that violence against women and women's employment, women's honor killings against us, for instance, when I say violence against women, things are not that great here as well. And at the moment, I think with Imran Khan stoking there is a mine of anti-US sentiment in Pakistan, a sort of there's a love of conspiracy. There's a that many of the problems that we have can be blamed on somebody bigger and more evil, allegedly. So I think he's managed to tap into it. So any help, I would say, at the moment would be seen with suspicion.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about the global pandemic? COVID-19 cases, deaths, recoveries. What's the situation in Pakistan? How does the data compare with what's going on across the South Asian region?
Mm-hmm. I will say that this is the one area where I think Khan's government did well, actually. When the first case of COVID-19 was reported in March 2020, we went into lockdown as well. And I would say that even though that there was a lot of criticism in the way the lockdowns were happening and cases did rise, eventually we kind of sort of found our feet, and we found a mechanism to coordinate among different agencies, different states. So there was a plan that was rolled out. And I think we escaped the brunt of it, or the worst of it. So we've had, I think, about over 30,000 deaths at my last count. But as of now, right now, I think with the Omicron as well as has receded as well, I think our positivity rate is now less than 1% at the moment. In fact, the sort of infrastructure that was set up to manage the pandemic has been shut down as well because cases were so low. We also had a very decent rollout of the vaccine. We couldn't afford them. We borrowed, we got some from the Chinese. We got a lot from the US, by the way, so thank you. And we managed to vaccinate at least, I think, about 60% of the adult population, as well as double doses. So it hasn't been as bad.
What's your best assessment of when the next elections are likely to be in Pakistan?
Okay, so since law and constitution don't matter at the moment, according to the law, if the parliament is dissolved, you're bound to have elections within 90 days.
Okay.
But at the moment, this is disputed because it is in the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court says the vote of no confidence has to hold, and Prime Minister Imran Khan is removed. Then the opposition was supposed to elect a new prime minister, and then there would have been some time to hold the next election. At the moment, where the clock is ticking, the Election Commission of Pakistan has been asked to hold elections in 90 days. In fact, Imran Khan has been taunting his opposition, saying, well, you wanted me to resign, you wanted me to go, now, well, let's face the public. But the problem is the Election Commission of Pakistan says it is underprepared. There's been some new legislation recently, so electronic voting machines, how to, the mechanism to get overseas Pakistanis to vote, Pakistanis who live abroad, constituencies need to be delimited. There's multiple sort of technical and logistical problems. It's going to be a nightmare.
Okay.
So it depends on the Supreme Court hearing and the final judgment and ruling. If the Supreme Court upholds the dissolution of Parliament, then elections in 90 days. If it doesn't, likely to be in the next 6 months.
What should political advocacy and media activism look like for developing country economies? What strategies, in your professional experience, works best?
That's a really interesting question, because I think there's also a question of whether journalists or how do activists operate in such under difficult conditions.
Right.
And I think what's also happened, it's also interesting, where populism or polarization has also forced people to take sides. If you align with the political party, I'm afraid that may be problematic. But if you keep to law and constitution, democratic values, I think you're all right. I think it's important to engage young people, because what I've seen is that Imran Khan appealed to a lot of younger people as an alternative to what were seen as very corrupt, dynastic political parties of old. But the problem is that he has not been able to engage them either. So they've become a kind of like a cult, where they don't engage with the political business. They don't understand law and constitution, for instance, or the importance of parliament and what democratic values ought to be. It's become more of a cult. So I think we really need to engage young people and begin in universities. I've seen a lot of, there's actually a lot of political activism in Pakistani youth. But the problem is that they're not allowed to unionize. And if you step over certain lines, you could be disappeared or you could be arrested. So that's why it becomes a little more dangerous to take a stand in Pakistan.
Amber Rahim Shamsi, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope I was able to explain a little bit of Pakistan.
And that's it for our program today. Remember, you can follow me and the show on Instagram or Twitter. Thank you so much for watching Feminism Today on Free Speech TV. Join us again next week.